battlefields of World War II are quiet now. Today, more than 50 years after the war's end, the story of the more than 1 million African Americans who fought on those faraway fields remains surrounded by silence too. Major funding for The Invisible Soldiers' Unheard Voices was provided in part by the Baha'i Faith. The Baha'i Faith, promoting unity and justice in America. Additional funding is provided by the Phelps-Stokes Fund. The Phelps-Stokes Fund, where education for human development is our primary mission and service to humanity our paramount motive. The Phelps-Stokes Fund, serving people since 1911. Support for this program was also provided by the National Association for Black Veterans, NABVETS, creating positive lifestyles for veterans and their families. NABVETS, Veterans in Unity for the Community. Additional support also by the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame and by Stanley Global Resources and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
The town is entered by Negro units of the 43rd Armored Infantry Battalion.
I was a proud man. I was so happy that I was participating in the greatest war in history, but I still couldn't understand this segregation.
Oh, beautiful, for heroes prove in liberating strife.
Many of us felt we never would get a chance to really fight.
Ooh, more than self, their country loved, and mercy more than life.
I couldn't go in, which I didn't realize at that time was because of the color of my skin.
America, oh, America. May God not go reply.
The battlefields of World War II are quiet now. Today, more than 50 years after the war's end, the story of the more than 1 million African Americans who fought on those faraway fields remains surrounded by silence too.
Hollywood is critical, and popular culture must understand our involvement in American society has been very intricate and complex over the years. And unless you get the scholars, the journalists, the Hollywood folk to promote this, not so much promote it, but at least mention it, it goes by like that, because who is going to pay a lot of attention to history?
If I look at the 20th century and I think of popular culture or scholarly works, and I'm looking for African American participation in those, I'm either going to get a story that goes untold, or often is not, one that's severely distorted.
Nobody wanted to recognize the accomplishment. They were kind of written out of the history books for 50 years. The point of it was that nobody wanted to talk about black heroism on a battlefield or black courage.
In the history books and in Hollywood films, the role of African Americans in World War II has been a little more than a footnote.
After World War II, in American popular culture, I would challenge you to find a movie where you found an African-American soldier as hero. All the way from the early John Ford movies of World War II right up to Saving Private Ryan, you won't find African-Americans serving in World War II. They were written out, and when you cut out of popular culture the historic role of African-Americans, you're really trying to deny people the truth.
Hollywood creates our understanding, our notions, our images of what war really is, even though it's a superficial kind of image. So when you see these movies of war, and you don't see the presence of African American people and soldiers, it's very easy to conclude they didn't do anything. They weren't there. There is no way possible for you to talk about World War II and not look at the fact that almost 1 million men served in the U.S. Army. So there's no way possible to overlook that unless you're just ignorant of it, you haven't done your research, or you don't care. It's not a part of the story that you want to tell.
The real story of African Americans in World War II took place in Europe, in the Pacific, and in training camps in the United States. They served in the segregated military. They died for a country that denied them the very freedoms they were fighting for. Their contribution would help defeat the German and Japanese war machines, and it would ignite the modern civil rights movement. It is time to tell the story as it really happened.
I never felt segregation and discrimination as keenly as I did until I went into the Army of the United States.
African Americans began to get their draft notices, and those that were called up, the War Department created a quota system here. They weren't calling that many in.
The United States Armed Forces during World War II was rife with racism. There's definitely separate and completely unequal forces. It was a segregated army, and it continued to be a segregated army and Navy. The Marines didn't even want African Americans in it.
You've got to remember that this country was very discriminatory, segregated, and there was no change. First of all, black sailors, as sailors per se, other than as mess attendants or stewards, weren't permitted into the Navy.
They thought of the Negro soldier as a thing apart. They did not treat him as an American who was in the Army, who would be asked to lay down his life for his country like any other American boy. They were stationed in the worst part of the post, close to the garbage dumps. They were not allowed to use the PX that was there for the use of everybody else on the post. They were not allowed to attend the white theater. And sadly enough, their officers were not allowed to go to the officers' club.
We were set up in a segregated barracks, which became our school and our living quarters. And this was done despite the fact that at Great Lakes, they had the largest officer candidate training school in the country. But we were not allowed to go to that school.
Fort Devens was probably no better than any other American Army base in 1941, 42, 43. It was segregated. The post commander, of course, was white. There was a white officers club. All of the facilities in the post were white. Signs, no colored were allowed. We had Afro-American, or Negro, or black MPs. They could not arrest white soldiers, even if caught in the act of violation of regulations or in violation of law. But white MPs certainly could and did arrest black soldiers.
If you're looking at where the sources of contention and racism in the U.S. Army, and you can take the whole military establishment, there were three main sources, starting with the officers' corps. A lot of those guys were Southerners, and they had no interest to see the success of Negro troops.
Officers more knowledgeable than myself came around and commiserated with me, and I asked them why. And they said, that's going to be the first Negro tank battalion the American Army's ever had. Do you know anything about Negroes? And I said, no, only when I see them. They said, you don't know what you're in for. When we got our filler of officers, many of them kept saying derogatory things about blacks, how they would never make it.
Then you had enlisted men, in which a good percent of the American Army came from the South, And of course, their experiences with African American people was one of viewing them in an inferior secondary capacity.
So I was acquainted with a black officer that, in fact, we came out of OCS together, and he accosted two white soldiers which walked past him without saluting and looked him in the eye and didn't salute. And he stopped them and made them salute. And they saluted and then went and told the sheriff. And the sheriff came and arrested the officer and took him downtown.
And the third was civilians, white civilians, because the overwhelming majority of camps were located in the South. And the huge problem was when those troops went on leave and went into town.
We were victims of being sent to locations where Negroes couldn't do any harm to cities they were stationed near.
I'd heard what happened to black people, or colored people as we were called it, south of the Mason-Dixon line, but I had no personal real experience, and my parents, who were Southerners, basically never talked about it.
It was this notion that comes out of civil society and how people perceived, believed, and felt what's the role for African American people in American society, and it was just transported into the military.
That's unbelievable to think that racism in the middle of war would be able to play that kind of role, but it did. And so you started having to, not only did an African American soldier have to watch his back for the enemy, he had to watch his back for the ally too, which was Uncle Sam.
There are movies that talk about the famous Lido Road that leads from the coast of India and goes up through China, a supply line over 1,000 miles. 65% of the men who worked on that road were black engineers. You wouldn't know that. Hollywood's not going to say that.
The Lido Road. Starting at Lido in northern India, the plan was to drive through jungles, rivers, mountains, and Jap opposition to a juncture with the Burma Road. A supply route would then be forged from Calcutta to Lido by rail, across the Lido-Burma Road to Kunming, and thence to Chungking in China. The Lido Road was begun by a handful of men facing a task that had been called impossible.
The handful of men is presumably white, as the film does not mention the more than 50,000 African-American engineers and construction crews primarily responsible for the road, as seen in a rarely shown Army film bulletin.
Freight trains of the Bengal-Assam Railroad pull into a transfer shed located near the point of origin of the Lido Road. A detachment of Negro engineers began work on the road in December 1942. In this headquarters area, the Negro units handle every phase of the operations incident to moving vital replacements along the Lido route. And when the first convoy from India to China rolled over the completed road, 25 months later, a Negro was driving the lead vehicle.
On the other side of the world, African-American troops battled frigid temperatures and blinding snow to build the Alcan Highway.
Well, black soldiers, some of them had never drove a bulldozer, had never drove a truck, a big heavy truck, never drove a road grader, but they learned how to use that and did that kind of work themselves. We wasn't taught to do none of that kind of work.
The terrain was very rough, it was unstable, it would vibrate, which made it rather difficult for the bulldozers. The temperatures varied anywhere from 32 below zero down to 65 below zero.
You were a black soldier. You had the absolute worst living conditions possible. If you were black, you would be in a lesser tent or a lesser quarter to live, that the white soldiers would be able to stay in a kind of more permanent sort of barrack or something that would help them to stay warm.
On the Alaskan Highway, the black troops were housed in pyramidal cloth tents, while the white soldiers were in Nissen huts and on housing some of the army bases. What protected the black soldiers inside of the tent, the frost was about an inch thick, which acted as insulation.
when D-Day is taking place, and there were up to maybe 6 combat units of African Americans involved in that particular engagement. And once the invasion of Europe takes place, that omission in Hollywood is very clear.
In The Longest Day, several black soldiers are visible for a few seconds in the background when the fighting is ended. There are no African Americans in Saving Private Ryan.
Quartermaster and other combat service support units were charged with going in on D-Day proper. So some of the first units to go ashore, some of those Arrowhead units went with the D-Day force proper. Some quartermaster soldiers came in with the airborne, the 82nd and 101st.
The all-African-American 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion manned the tethered balloons that were critical in keeping the German Luftwaffe from strafing the invasion force.
D-Day was the most emotional and dangerous day of my life. My job was a medic with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion.
We went all the way around, past battle wagons, battleships. Everything is firing broadside on Normandy. And that's when our ship ran over a submerged mine. That incapacitated that motor at LCT. You have no method for moving. You're going in with the tide. That's what took us in, the tide. You can't visualize how many troops and how many ships and stuff went down on the way in.
The number of casualties on Omaha Beach was phenomenal. We had never seen that many or even thought that there would be that many casualties. I helped, along with the other medics, to dress and to do the best we could with the wounded.
The guy who was with me, who was a tank man, he was standing beside me. He said, "What is that over there?" I said, "Looks like a ship. Are they dead or are they alive?" "They're dead." "Oh my God." That's it.
You could hear the shell, the mortar coming. Halfway down, the mortar landed on the other side of that truck, and the shrapnel and stuff from the mortar shell hit me in the left leg as well as the right leg. Being in a segregated army at that time, when we actually combined our resources with the white troops, there was no such thing as segregated. Because the people who were wounded, and if you're a medic, they don't care exactly who, what the color of the person was, or his skin or anything like that. Only thing they wanted was aid.
Surgeons, just even in the beginning of the Normandy campaign, found that they were using blood in transfusions about 3 or 4 times the rate expected. Well, the blood transfusion was an example of the kind of racial discrimination that went on at that time, because there was a policy not to give black blood to white troops. The Red Cross segregated the blood. The irony of this, of course, it was an African-American doctor, Drew, who did some of the pioneering work that allowed the preservation of blood so that it could be used for transfusion. One contingent of black nurses that was sent to the ETO were assigned to one of the station hospitals in England. But it was a station hospital that was assigned to caring for German POWs. General Hawley had the black nurses to use, and he really didn't want them to use for white American troops, so he used them for the Germans. The nurses had the feeling they had been singled out for a separate service and had no real possibility of transfer or advancement. And sadly, that was pretty much the case.
You know, the famous sign people would give is the V for victory. And African Americans would do both the V for victory and a V for hopefully smashing Jim Crow laws, segregation. And the great hope of African Americans was taking part in World War II, showing patriotism, showing valor, showing love of the flag, putting their life on the line for the United States of America. And the hope was that after this experience that they would be able to come back to a better America.
In England, in particular in France, one of the things that took place that was very interesting was that American troops would transport their racism to English society and to French society. What the Army would do, particularly officers, enlisted men would do, was to tell the town peoples, the people who ran the bars and the stores, not to service troops, and pointed out that they're inferior, they're animals.
They resented the fraternization between the Italian girls and Afro-American soldiers. Fights would ensue. Our soldiers had to travel in groups for protection.
A portion of the unit of the 29th Infantry Division, wasn't that many of them, they came in that night. And the first saying they said when they got in there, where in the hell did all these men come from?
Many in the English society refused to believe that and rejected it. In fact, there's a story in Newsweek of March 1944 where it points out, it tells a story of a pub owner kicks out white soldiers because they would come in and start fights.
They had to call the MPs and take the full 29th personnel out and said, you people can stay here, because the girls said, these people are going to stay. They're not going anywhere, this is our friends.
Over there, I'm talking, we learned, I'm talking, the people there were very different from the people here in the United States. They treated us better, I'm talking about, they welcomed us better.
The white wax had been serving overseas for almost 2 years by this time, but overseas commanders did not want black women to come over. So finally, with the pressure of all the Negro press and the civil rights organizations, they finally decided they would send one group overseas. We lived separately, we worked separately, and we operated as a separate battalion. Our outfit was completely black, and this was a great curiosity to many people. And one of the things I had to do at one point, we had so many visitors, I had to cut 1/4 of an inch off of a chair so it would slide down. And you know, when a colonel starts sliding down and can't sit up straight, he excuses himself.
By the end of 1944, nearly 480,000 African Americans were serving overseas. In Italy, the only African American pilots in the American Armed Forces were setting records. They were the Tuskegee Airmen of the 99th Pursuit Squadron and the 332nd Fighter Group, which were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group. Dubbed the Red Tails, the black pilots became the Army Air Corps' premier bomber escort squadron.
The 332nd never lost a bomber to an enemy fighter in 200 missions stretching from May of 44 to April of 45. That is a unique record. No white unit, and all the rest of them were white, that stayed in the hunt as long as they did could make that claim.
But the Tuskegee Airmen were made invisible to the men whose lives they were protecting and to American popular culture until the making of the movie The Tuskegee Airmen in 1996.
The commander of the 33rd Group was an avowed segregationist, and he did everything he could to keep the unit segregated. They were on a different part of the airfield. They weren't invited to join the officers' club on his part of the airfield. They were kept segregated in every way, shape, or form. Probably the worst thing that the commander did to them is that in their first combat missions, he didn't allow a veteran pilot to lead them into combat.
This rankled some of us because we felt here we were flying combat, fighting for our country, doing what we should be doing, and still we was being treated like pariahs by the rest of them.
One of the Army's best kept secrets was that there was a black fighter group. We had no idea that the Red Tails, who had given us the finest escort and whose escort we preferred, were black pilots. Not an idea in the world.
Being prepared to go overseas and risk our lives and being discriminated and segregated at the same time was a hard pill to swallow. And men suffered inwardly and outwardly from it. and it had a devastating effect on the morale of our soldiers at home, and an even more devastating effect on the morale of our soldiers when we finally went overseas.
In Italy, American troops suffered high casualties in difficult fighting. In films like Anzio, all of those soldiers are white. In reality, the all-black 92nd Infantry Division and the Japanese-American 442nd Infantry Regiment also were mired in the bloody Italian fighting against well-entrenched German forces. Their experience under the command of General Edward Alman and his white officers would stay with them for life.
When I got to the 92nd Division, to me, watching the officers of the 92nd Division and talking with them, it was the most shocking thing that I've ever encountered. Now, with regard to the whites, it's my view that there was a deliberate pattern of assigning the dregs of the officer corps to the black units.
I was angry. It made me feel very, very angry. The fact that my intelligence was insulted every time that I would make a suggestion on a tactic. The black officers were never given any latitude in any command situation at all. I was downgraded because I was black.
General Alman was one of the most prejudiced men, most prejudiced officers that I served under. He was extreme in his views and his lack of respect for subordinates. He had no respect for, especially for black men.
The 366th Infantry Regiment was the Army's only infantry unit with an all-black enlisted and officer corps.
Of the 132 officers, 128 of those officers had college degrees. Some had master's degrees, and a few had PhD degrees.
When the 366th was assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy, they came under the command of white officers for the first time.
And that was the worst news I think we could get, probably only exacerbated by the welcoming speech that General Alman gave to the 366th Infantry Regiment when it arrived. He seemed somewhat angry, and he said, as best I can recall, your Negro newspapers and your Negro politicians have been screaming for you to come over here and go into combat. I didn't ask for you to come, but I'm going to see that you get combat and your share of casualties. It was anything but a welcome address or a battle indoctrination address. There were men who even grumbled and talked about shooting him, and that's a cruel thought, but the circumstances were such that it just points out how far racism can go and how sad racism is. I think it's fair to say we were undertrained for combat soldiers. Colonel Queen asked for 30 days in which to give us intensive training in preparation for entry into the lines, but I think we got 5 days. We were primarily at that time sort of holding the line so that the Germans could not take troops from Italy into Germany or into France or any other place where they might need them.
The German soldiers in Italy were seasoned soldiers. They had come from another front. Namely, I think most of them came from southern France. They knew what they were doing. When you ran up against a bunch of them, you knew you were in a fight. On the 5th and 6th of April, my unit fought alongside the 442nd Battalion, which is an all-Japanese unit.
We had just been brought in early April of '45 to join the 92nd in its last push to break the line.
Like Danny Inouye, for example, I didn't know that Danny was in the 442nd, and here we were serving on the same committees in the Senate. We were in the war practically right next to each other.
Let's face it, we were there because of our race. And the same thing with the African Americans. If we looked like the general populace, there'd be no fuss. But we look like Mongolians, and the African Americans look like Africans. And to fight under those circumstances, it's not the easiest.
The directions that came down from the 92nd Infantry Division and from the higher headquarters were so flawed and so inept that there was no way that success could have been achieved.
Our attacks were usually frontal attacks. When we had frontal attacks against entrenched locations of the enemy, obviously they're prepared, they know you're coming.
At that time, we were up on the mountains, and the 92nd was on the flatlands. It's easier to fight in the mountains than in the flatlands, because in the mountains there are a lot of trees and gullies and valleys, but out there you're wide open. So the artillery observer from the other side can see every movement. So you're being shot like ducks in a pond.
And it has often been said we were used as cannon fodder. To see them die unnecessarily, though we expected that we'd have casualties, we knew some had to die. We knew what war was, or we'd heard what war was. But it was so close to us. We were so close to each other. It was tough. It was very, very tough.
Well, we're surprised that they kept on fighting, because if we had to fight under the same circumstances, I think some of the enthusiasm or the morale, obviously, would be dampened.
The question as to whether they would have intentionally used us for cannon fodder. Certainly, looking on it in retrospect, one could come to that conclusion. I don't want to charge them with it. The results were the same.
What made me very close to the men of the 92nd Division came about on April 21st. That's when I was wounded several times. I was first shot through my stomach, but for some reason there are no pain nerves around there, so you know it's dripping blood, but you keep on going. And about a couple hours later, my arm got blown off, but that wasn't enough. I put a tourniquet, kept on going until they hit my leg. Then I couldn't move, so then I got evacuated. Obviously, I lost a lot of blood. There was a practice in that sector, I don't know if it was worldwide, but at that sector, whenever they gave you a transfusion, they showed you the bottle. And the bottle would have the name, the rank, serial number, and the unit. I was able to read about 10 of them. I was told I was given 17 transfusions, about 7 or 8 of them while I was unconscious, but of the 10, all 10 were from the 92nd. So in my veins are black blood. And I've said this many times, if it weren't for the men of the 92nd Division, I'd be dead. It's their blood that kept me going. And here I am, a senator.
What Hollywood's version of the war in the Pacific doesn't show are the thousands of African American soldiers and Marines who served in the Allied island hopping campaign. In the 1998 Academy Award-nominated film, The Thin Red Line, which centers on units in the Pacific, there are no blacks. The all-black 24th Infantry Division fought with white troops in the jungles of Bougainville. Black Marine Depot companies served with white Marine combat units in some of the most desperate and heroic fighting of the war.
A depot company was more or less like a utility company. So a utility company could be used in any capacity, even in frontline combat, because when the Marines went on Tarawa, something like 1,000 people got killed in 3 days fighting. I think they lost approximately 4,000 on Iwo Jima. They lost thousands on Okinawa. When you're on that beachhead and they're dropping those mortars and artillery shells on you, that's about as much frontline combat as you can get in.
Black gunners on Navy ships shot enemy aircraft from the sky. African-American Seabees built airstrips on Pacific Islands. And black soldiers drove the ducks that carried Marines into battle on Iwo Jima.
I came off there with my amphibious duck loaded with a 105 Hauser and 7 Marines. On the radio, but don't come in on Red Beach, it was too hot, come in on Green. The water was real rough because, you know, you gotta have training to know how to drive that duck on when the water is rough and your ramp is coming up and down. Well, I tell you, I was scared going in, I was scared coming back. All that far over top and you don't know what's gonna hit you.
On shore, Black Marines faced the same nightmare of enemy fire that pounded white Marine combat troops.
I hit Iwo Jima with the 34th Marine Depot Company about D+3. This was the night of D+3. And they put me and a few other black Marines up to hold that line. As it grew on and got darker, I realized that I was up on that line by myself. There being no light so you can see, all around me I could hear Japanese talking.
The intensity of the fire on such a small area that one could have been killed at any one time, at any one place.
Most pride, I think, is having put your life on your line for your country. The feeling then was that you would have lost your life for a good reason, a good purpose.
We continued and completed 183 days straight of combat duty, and the only reason why we didn't do more is because the Germans quit.
General Patton was a bigot, you know. In his memoirs, he never talks about the black soldiers.
In spite of his personal views, General George Patton knew he needed manpower to win the last great battles in the heart of Europe. He put the all-black 761st Tank Battalion on the battlefield.
And we went to a little plant not too far from Nancy, and that's where we all assembled. And then we got visited by General Patton. And he told us that, you know, who he was, and he says, I have nothing but the best, and I sent for you. And he says, don't let me down, and don't let your people down.
The Academy Award-winning film Patton uses part of the speech Patton gave to the 761st, who trained at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana.
30 years from now, when you're sitting around your fireside with your grandson on your knee, and he asks you, what did you do in the Great World War II? You won't have to say, well, I shoveled shit in Louisiana.
But the 761st is never mentioned or shown. The only African-American to appear in a film that gave many Americans their picture of the Battle of the Bulge is Patton's valet. In reality, the men of the 761st, including future Medal of Honor winner Sergeant Reuben Rivers, performed heroic duty in one of the war's most horrific battles.
What used to surprise me, I wondered, why did we pass all of these tanks, pull over to the side, a division, and here come the 761st, beat up, tired tank battalion to go in and lead the way.
The average life of a separate tank battalion in combat against the Germans was from 10 to 15 days.
And General Patton said, send them niggers back up there. When we had gone and stayed 15 days in our first battle, we went back and we stayed 183 days straight.
It was to be a record for the most unbroken days of engagement of any tank unit in the war. In the Battle of the Bulge, the 761st was critical in rescuing the 26th Infantry and 17th Airborne Divisions, who were being decimated by heavy German fire.
Well, the Battle of the Bulge was the worst, to me, one of the worst.
They said there was a slight bulge in the line, but it turned out to be the biggest battle I ever had.
We had to go 65 miles to Bastogne where the American was trapped.
I don't know just how many degrees below zero, but the wind was blowing terrible, and
it was dank and gray, and it was snowing.
It was about knee-deep to start with, because it had been snowing for several days. They told us there were just a few Germans there, but there was a Panzer, which is a tank battalion, or more than that, a regiment probably.
We were truly nervous in Bastogne because behind every tree there was a dead soldier. Enemy or yours?
We was laying right, you just lay right beside each other, touching. He was here and I was on the left side, and he got shot right in the back. I don't know why they missed me. There were 235 in the morning in the company, and that night there were 65. All day, and then that night I said we retreated, but I was told we withdrew back to where we started that morning. We had tank support that time, the 761st Tank Battalion. You know, that was a good sight. They were sure welcome. They were real good. They fired into the woods and got everything softened up. We just walked up there and they was all waiting for us. They fought side by side with the white people there, and that's the only thing that saved them probably at Bastogne.
See, we never worked with anyone but white infantry units. Maybe the first few hours, they felt that our services were not needed. But after having had a few minutes of experience with German gunnery and so forth, we were called, and once we were committed, they got to the place where they wouldn't even let our shadows hit the ground. They stayed so close to us.
There was a definite program afoot to suppress acts of bravery or acts of heroism on the part of the black soldiers. I never heard any stories or any comments concerning bravery by black soldiers from any of the white officers. Every time we turned around, we would hear about acts of bravery of the white soldiers.
Our most important battle, which the Army has considered to be important enough to be depicted in the Pentagon as one of the 10 major battles, was the Battle of the Lost Battalion, where we were called upon to rescue a battalion of the 36th Division, a Texas division. It took us about 5 days and we had 800 casualties. You know, it was a real bloody one. That battle was not made public until about the end of the war. The Stars and Stripes didn't cover that. They would cover all other battles.
In Aiken, the 761st fought 2 days for that town. We're in the 26th, I believe, Infantry Division. And the 4th Armored Division, they had us to pull over. The 4th Armored Division came through, and they said that the 4th Armored Division captured Aiken, and they got the credit for doing it. We didn't get any credit.
The first troops to liberate Dachau, you know, the concentration camp, were units of the Patton's army, the 3rd Army. That unit was from my regiment. Because of the fast movement in that war in the last few days, this unit found itself ahead of the whole division, in front of the infantry. And suddenly they came across this concentration camp. They had no idea what it was. but then they realized soon that this was a prison camp. When the officers of Patton's army found out what had happened, they immediately put a clamp on it. Our men were told, you don't talk about it. So keep in mind that many of the men in my regiment volunteered from behind barbed wire. They were in these camps, these American concentration camps. And they volunteered while they were incarcerated. And so I think the officers must have felt the headlines would look terrible. Concentration camp liberated by men from concentration camps. So that became public about 10 years ago. Up until then, it was classified.
761st was assigned to the 71st Infantry Division at the time that this division liberated the camp near Wels, Austria. The name of the camp was Gunskirchenlager, and it was one of the smaller refugee camps or concentration camps.
Sergeant Floyd Dade of the 761st and concentration camp survivor Sally Ganor would meet again 50 years later. In the years since the war, neither man had talked to anyone about their first meeting.
Number one, nobody would believe you, and it's hard. Those are bad memories to talk about. My body would just shut down.
I still have to think back of him sitting there on top of the tank like a black god looking down on me.
What were we going to find? Were we going to find the same things that we had left behind us when we went to war? Was it going to be any better? Was it going to be any worse? Which was a possibility.
African Americans came home and in many ways were denounced for their service, particularly in the South. Why? Well, the point of Jim Crow was to keep African Americans down. And if an African American came back in his military uniform, back into a Selma, Alabama, or back to Biloxi, Mississippi, the whites that stayed home, in particular, wanted to beat the daylights out of them.
We came back with the 49th Infantry Division. We went straight down to Camp Stewart, Georgia. The first words we heard was, here comes that nigger group. Got all them medals over there in France. We're going to make sure that we're going to take care of them while they're down here.
So I was standing down on the corner of 14th and Independence Avenue, all dressed up in my blues. And I never got so many hate stares in my life from white servicemen who looked at me as if they said, who does he think he is?
So immediately, from the moment they returned to America, they realized that things were not going to continue in any kind of sense of them being treated as patriots or being awarded medals of honor or being applauded nationally for their service.
I tell the story, apocryphal stories, where we came back from overseas and we came down the gangplank. We were hero fighter pilots. There was a white soldier saying, blacks over here, whites over here. And that was the ultimate. The white troops had the press beating them. All the black troops had was a couple of people from the black press. And we did not get the accolades that we should have gotten because of the prejudice.
The war is where race and democracy intersect. And really the seeds of the modern civil rights movement are planted in World War II. And this is the real significance of this war, because African Americans clearly decided, this is our country. You can't have black men fighting for democracy in Europe, and they don't have it here. And what the war does is confront these notions, these ideas that's embedded in the Constitution about freedom and democracy. And what black veterans did was to put that up to the face of American society and say, look at yourself. This is about freedom, democracy, and opportunity for our treatment, and we are American citizens too.
One of the really unwritten aspects of this century is that link between the African Americans who served in World War II, who went on to become leaders in the civil rights movement. Take the example of Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was from Mississippi. Medgar Evers served with distinction in the Second World War, came back to Mississippi in uniform, said, "I fought for democracy and Mississippi," because he loved his home state. He came back and he couldn't vote in Mississippi. And the two are so linked, World War II and civil rights, that without the World War II experience of African Americans serving their country and facing the humiliation they came back, I don't think Harry Truman would have moved to integrate the armed services as quickly as he did, and I don't think you would have had the leadership potential coming out of the movement of a Reverend Hosea Williams, of a Medgar Evers, and dozens of others who had the courage because they just saw their buddies killed. They just saw their best friend's head blown off. And now and they did all that. They put their life on the line for this thing called democracy. And they came back to a country that didn't have democracy. So my God, they were going to get it.
I am proud to have been a Marine, and you'll find most black Marines think the same way that I do.
There's always something to pay for racism or bigotry or discrimination. No question about that. But I think the contributions of organizations like the 92nd Division were made known to the highest command. And I think the 92nd Division, for example, played a major role in Truman's decision to desegregate the military.
Someone commented recently at a convention, a white officer who was joining us at a P-51 convention, and he said he was always startled when he got around a bunch of the old veterans that we talked so much and we didn't talk about, there I was at 30,000 feet behind the guy. He said, you never talk about combat. He said, you always talk about what happened to you in Tuskegee, what happened to you at Freeman Field, about being banned from officers' clubs and flying combat and not being treated well. And I tried to explain to him that that was really our great combat.
I believe I'm an American, and I believe this is my land, and I've always felt patriotic about it. I still to this day, and I certainly did in the Army. But if you have that kind of patriotism, you have to have it in spite. If you are black, you have to have it in spite of the segregation and discrimination and the injustices that you have to live with.
My sergeant major came in to me and said I had a problem. I asked him what it was, and he said some of our men had stolen a truck. And I went outside, and there was about a dozen of our men in a truck that didn't have our insignia on it. They all had big smiles on their face, and they were saluting. They had been wounded, hospitalized. They knew their buddies needed them because there were no tank replaces. They stole the truck and went AWOL, not from combat, to combat. These are the kind of guys these men were.
With brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Oh yeah, America, America, God shed His grace on me.
Major funding for The Invisible Soldiers' Unheard Voices was provided in part by the Baha'i Faith. The Baha'i Faith, promoting unity and justice in America. Additional funding is provided by the Phelps-Stokes Fund. The Phelps-Stokes Fund, where education for human development is our primary mission and service to humanity our paramount motive. The Phelps-Stokes Fund, serving people since 1911. Support for this program was also provided by the National Association for Black Veterans, NABVETS, creating positive lifestyles for veterans and their families. NABVETS, Veterans in Unity for the Community. Additional support also by the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame and by Stanley Global Resources and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. To order a video copy of The Invisible Soldiers' Unheard Voices on video cassette, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Thank you.